are full time with Kate today. So I'm going to get us started so we don't lose 1 second of her genius. So we'll get going now, and as folks come in, they can just catch up. Just so good afternoon, hello, happy Monday. Greetings from I think I'm in Boylston, Massachusetts, at the Botanical Gardens. If you have not been here, I highly recommend it. It's beautiful. We have a meeting here today, and so I'm sneaking off into another room. And so if I'm moving around, it's because I'm getting kicked out of where I'm squatting right now. So, welcome. We are here today to do more of our work on our Reducing Neglect initiative. And so grateful for you to all be here. Um, this educational series is part of the Massachusetts initiative to reduce child neglect. That name will be changing some point in the coming future. But in the meantime, I'll just probably call it the initiative throughout today. The initiative is a statewide effort focused on improving how families access support to reduce unnecessary child welfare involvement. Essentially, it's our shift of the Massachusetts ecosystem so that we're supporting families first before we're reporting them or sending them to any state systems. We really want to make sure our families are able to access the help that they want, that they need, when they want it, where they need it, where they want it, and really as an alternative pathway for all. We know this is complex and there is many different players in this work. And so this series is meant to help build a shared understanding across that diversity. So each session is designed to go a little bit deeper into key points that we are bringing through. So it may be data, policy, practice, lived experience, and many other topics so that we can ground this work in a common set of facts and insights. So this is not about having all of the answers today. This is about more learning together, asking questions, building toward more informed decisions in the initiatives, and keeping people engaged in between all of the times that we're together in person and in between our monthly working group meetings. If you are brand new to this work, Liz is going to drop into the comments where you can click on the link and you can sign up and you can start getting the monthly newsletters that we are sending out and join one of the working groups and just become a much bigger part of this learning series that we have and the overall initiative that we have going. All right, without further ado, I am so pleased and honored to get to introduce everybody to Kate Warren Barnes. And so before I read a little bit of her bio, I want to tell a little brief story because I think it's a good representation of Kate and what she fully embodies. So Kate's heard me tell this story way too many times, but when I got this job, I have been a clinician my whole career. And then I went into administration, but I still was clinical work. And this was my first foray into policy and into the bureaucracy of state systems. And so Kate was the first person that I called. And Kate and I didn't know each other super well, but I knew she was a policy queen, and I knew she had been in this work for a really long time and for children and families. And I knew she was someone that I wanted to be part of the work with me. I didn't know how exactly, but I just knew, like, Kate, I need you somehow in this world. So I picked up the phone and we started talking, and I was like, Kate, I don't know anything about policy. And she's like, I got you. I'm right here with you. Like, whatever you need, let's go. We went and had coffee a couple of times. She gave me some good downloads. And that was the beginning of what has become this really great partnership. And Kate is now a major integral piece of this initiative work that we are doing and has been at it with us as a consultant and really has opened up the doors to many of you here in this room being here today and others across the whole initiative. And so we are forever grateful for Kate to creating the community and opening up the doors and advising on how we do this better. So that is just my personal side with Kate and my gratitude for her. But for those of you who want to know a little bit more about like the meat behind her work, Kate is a curator of community who finds wholeness through connection with others. As a social worker, strategist, qualitative researcher, professor, and advocate, Kate believes in the power of community, policy, and relational organizing to drive transformative social change. Kate works to help individuals navigate complex systems while also transforming them. Her unique approach to social impact work blends systems change with healing centered practices that place the voices of those with lived experience at the center. Kate's contributions have resulted in the successful passage of legislation that strengthens the social work profession and improves the health and well-being of children, families, and residents across the Commonwealth of Massachusetts and beyond. And I think that fully embodies the story I was just saying about Kate. She lives it, breathes it, and is true to that description. And so, so pleased and so excited to have this next hour and a half with you, Kate. And so, without further ado, Kate, take the stage.
Well, thank you, Jen. Thank you for that really kind introduction. As you were speaking, I'm like, oh, that person sounds like fun. I want to hang out with that person. It's like, oh, she is me. But thank you. I appreciate that and so grateful for your visionary leadership in bringing this work to life because we can sit and have coffees all day and talk about how children and families deserve better, but you're doing the work to create and curate the spaces where we're really doing that work in community together. So thank you. All right. I am going to go ahead and do the hardest part of any meeting, which is sharing the slides. So hopefully folks are able to see those. I can't see all of you, but this, I promise, will be a very interactive, engaging conversation. So if you want to have cameras on, use of emojis, all of that good stuff, I don't want you to just be passive consumers of what we're going to talk about today, but rather active participants and engaging with this work. So here's our roadmap for today. We are going to hopefully do some personal intention setting and set up an opportunity for reflexive praxis that is grounded in the lived experience of folks based on how they navigate systems for their children. And so that is the roadmap. The way we get there is I'm going to share a story banking project first that we did with the Children's Trust. And then second, I'm going to share a snippet of my dissertation because while these were two very different processes, they were both grounded in the lived experience of adults who have very strong recommendations, feelings about well-being for themselves and their children. And so that is the invitation to bear witness to what these incredible humans have shared and understand what does that mean for us, how we show up in the work, and how we care for children and families. So, as Jen mentioned, we're going to be changing the name of this initiative, but if you are here and you are not yet connected with this initiative, you're going to see this slide multiple times. But you can scan this QR code while we're talking, no time like the present, to get signed up and connected to this really important work. So just the first invitation to not just be in community with us on today, but to continue to be in this work in whatever way feels right and good for you. One other piece of this work that I want to ground and center us in, because you're going to see this slide multiple times and hear this multiple times, this community approach to advancing child well-being is rooted in what we're calling the 4 pillars of prevention: policy, programs, workforce, and community. And so you're going to hear this often over and over again today, like where within this work do these recommendations, do these experiences that we've heard live, where do they belong? These also represent the different working groups of this initiative. So as we go through today's conversation, if one of these are really speaking to you, this is again an invitation to invite you into this work to join us either at a convening that we'll have in December or as part of one of these work groups that is working fairly regularly. So more to come on that, but just want to set the seeds of intention for that. And then just a little more housekeeping for me before we dive into the really good stuff. What I'm going to share today, one was a project of the Children's Trust, one was my dissertation. So the views and some of the things that I'm going to share do not necessarily represent any of the organizations that I'm employed or affiliated with. The other grounding and centering I want to do is it is June, and I could not let this month pass or this training pass without honoring that June is Pride Month, but this year it also it is the second annual Stolen Children's Month. And Stolen Children's Month is an opportunity for us to pause and remember children, all children who were forcibly removed from their families and communities. In this nation, from orphan trains to chattel slavery to the genocide of indigenous people, family separation has long been a practice in this nation, a very violent practice in this nation's history, and it continues today. And so I thought it important to name that on today because there may be other folks with lived experience in this space. I am what is, called a stolen child as someone who spent time in the child welfare system and was ultimately adopted. But I'm also a stolen child who cares for stolen children as a licensed foster care provider. So this is a moment to pause and acknowledge this month, this new month, as this is only the second annual, and just to name that month for anyone else with lived experience who maybe has joined us on today. And so what I just shared is start of what we sometimes call in academia a positionality statement. And I think sharing a positionality statement is an important practice, not just in academia, but in these spaces, because it provides a reflexive account where researchers or presenters can situate their social identities and their lived experience in relationship to research projects or topics that they've been working on so that there is full transparency about how those things shape the work that they're doing. Now, to attend to my positionality across the different projects that you're going to hear about today, I acknowledge that there could be the potential for bias. And so I engaged in a very intensive practice of reflexivity, one that I invite you all into today as well. And also did peer debriefing with colleagues, with friends in the space to support critical consciousness raising and to ensure that these processes, that these projects were guided by an anti-oppressive praxis. Okay, so that is enough about me. I want to hear about y'all. So this is your invitation to join us on camera or get your fingers on your keyboard and get ready to engage with who is in the room. And so I want to start by saying this is a safe and brave space for all of us to connect, learn, and grow together. And it is my intention that we promote empowerment, inclusivity, and collaboration in the space. So, as we get started, I invite you to use the doors of the chat to introduce yourself. You can say your name, your organization, anything you want to share in the chat so that we can get to know who is here in space together. And as I just pause and take a break, and I'm going to take a sip of water while y'all are doing that, there will be another question that I will ask folks to engage in after you've maybe taken a moment to introduce yourself in the chat and see who else might be in space with you today. Great. Welcome, friends. I see some new friends, some old friends. Welcome, one and all. Thank you for introducing yourself in the chat. Welcome, welcome. Love, we have some friends from out of state. Welcome, welcome. Great. Thanks for introducing yourselves. And if you've ever been in a presentation with me, you know I love using the chat. I love using emojis, and you'll hear more ways that you can use all of those as a form of community engagement today. But the next question that I want to ask is around mandated reporters. And so by show of your virtual hand or by your there's a little virtual hand raise feature you can use or your physical hand. Who in the space today is a mandated reporter? I see virtual hands going up, lots of virtual hands going up. Okay, so we have lots of folks in the space that are mandated reporters. Thank you for sharing that. Great. So we now have a sense of, through some introductions in the chat and the raising of physical and virtual hands, about who is in the room and in the space today. Now, if we have folks who maybe aren't familiar with who mandated reporters are, every single state is required by federal statute to say who a mandated reporter is. And so in Massachusetts and in most states, those are healthcare providers and mental health providers. They're folks that we find across education, both early education and care, K through 12 and high school. They're also individuals in child serving and human services roles. So it's our friends in EI, our friends in WIC, but it's also our friends who work as first responders, police, fire, folks in the legal field, lawyers. Our clergy and religious leaders, they're also mandated reporters in Massachusetts, and our youth sports coaches and athletic staff. So it really is a broad range of individuals who serve as mandated reporters. So what does that mean in Massachusetts if you're a mandated reporter? Well, the law requires that mandated reporters immediately make an oral report to our Department of Children and Families, or DCF, when in their professional capacity, they have a reasonable cause to believe that a child under 18 is suffering from abuse or neglect. So that's the who of mandated reporting and the what they have to do. And this is, I think, a really important foundational grounding for the conversation we're going to have today. So for those of you that raised your virtual hand or your physical hand and said that you're a mandated reporter, I have another question for you. And that is, how often do you think about your role as a mandated reporter? So in the chat, if you could drop a number 1, a number 2, or a number 3. How often do you think about your role as a mandated reporter? You can drop a number 1 for often, a number 2 for rarely, or a number 3 for never. I'm seeing a lot of 1s, 2s. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. You know what? It's funny. I've now done this presentation a couple times. I haven't seen a 3 yet. And so I'm starting to see a lot of patterns of a lot of 1s and 2s. And thank you for sharing that. I'm not somebody who's going to bury the lead. I'm basically going to tell you the key findings from both of the projects I'm going to talk about is, as mandated reporters, you're thinking about this often, and the families you serve are often thinking about it as well. And so I think we have more in common with the children and families that we're serving than we even realize when it comes to this concept of mandated reporting. So thank you for sharing that. Okay. So given that we have a lot of 1s and 2s in the space, this is an opportunity for you to voice note, journal, draw, just reflect on your role as an individual and consider how you support children and families. So this is the invitation to reflexivity, to set an intention, just to think about in your work with children and families, how are we supporting them? And what does that look like? So just give folks a minute to hold space for that. And then I mentioned community engagement. So as we're chatting today, please feel free if there's something that's a question, a new idea, something that really surprises you, something that resonates with you, maybe a seed that has been planted, a little seedling that you want to take with you. Please feel free at the bottom of your screen to use the emoji reaction feature. I can't see all your faces, or maybe you've chosen to be off screen, but by using some of the different emojis creatively, it can help all of us understand the temperature in the room, what people are feeling, what's resonating, what they're taking away. So please feel free to use emoji reactions as a form of community engagement with one another together today. All right, so here is the first project that we're going to dive into together. Again, there's going to be 2 different projects that we're going to talk about. This is the first. A snippet of my dissertation will be the second. And so this first project we have called, and if you know me, you know I love alliteration, almost to a fault. This first project is called the Massachusetts Mandates, Missteps, and Missed Opportunities, Family-Led Insights to Prevent Unnecessary Reports of Neglect. And so what was the purpose of this project? Why did we do this? Well, as Jen mentioned, in one of those first coffees that we had, I said, Jen, anything we're going to do together, we need to do by starting with the voices of lived experience. And we both had this really deep commitment and shared interest in talking with folks who have experienced reports of neglect that they felt were unnecessary. And we didn't just want to talk to them to hear about what happened. We wanted to ask them if we were to go upstream, if we were to prevent that report of neglect from ever happening, what could have been done? And so that was the purpose of this project, was to do a process of story banking where we got in community with folks and asked that very question. And so last summer, exactly a year ago, we set out to find individuals over the 18 across Massachusetts who had had experiences with a report of child neglect. And so we call them lived experience leaders. These lived experience leaders were from across the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. They ranged in age from 19 to 54. There were 11 individuals. You can see the breakdown of their ethnicity was primarily Black, but we also had folks who identified as white, multiracial, and Latinx. The really interesting thing about this community of lived experience leaders, they were both children and in some cases, children and parents when the report of neglect was filed. So we talked to some folks who said, I was a child, a parent, one of my parents or both of my parents had a report of neglect filed on them. And then in some cases, these were parents who had reports filed on them for reportedly neglecting their children. I also want to name that children with disabilities were very represented in this study. So a lot of the parents that we spoke to had children who either had physical disabilities, or I love one of the moms referred to her child as being not neurodivergent, but neurospicy. So I've taken to using neurospicy in a lot of spaces in honor of that lived experience expert. And of these folks that we talked to, there were 10 women and one man who participated. So that's a little bit about who we spoke to a year ago. Now, as part of doing this work, we wanted to ground and center very first in what were your hopes and aspirations for yourself, for your family? When you were a young person and maybe were experiencing what your parents were going through with a report of neglect, what were your hopes and aspirations? And so wanted to create a safe, healing, affirming space before diving in to some really difficult questions with these folks. And this is what came up in terms of their hopes and aspirations. They wanted to be homeowners. Many of them wanted to have jobs in the helping professions. They wanted to be nurses and social workers. They wanted to have a healthy, thriving family that could do fun things together. Their hopes and aspirations were not much different than the hopes and aspirations that you and I maybe have as individuals, or the hopes and aspirations that we have for our own children. So that's how we started the conversation with these folks, was around their hopes and their aspirations. So again, how did we find them? What did we do? It was a qualitative story banking process where we had these 11 adults over the age of 18 that we asked semi-structured questions to. So we had key questions we wanted to get to, but we really let these folks be leaders in their lived experience and share in ways that they really thought made sense for them. On average, the conversations lasted about an hour to an hour and a half. And we did follow up with them after the first conversation to make sure that we were accurately capturing what they shared with us in the first conversation. In those interviews, it was myself and another interviewer. This was one of the strategies that we used to help mitigate bias. And then when we were looking for themes and patterns and everything that was shared with us, there were also two of us participating in that process, again, to mitigate bias and to ensure that we were looking at basically what was data. These stories became data, looking at them through various different lenses. So again, the key question here was what could have been done to prevent the reports, or in some cases, multiple reports of child neglect that these individuals experience. So again, I'm not one to bury the lead or leave you in suspense. But the key takeaway from what we heard from every single one of these 11 individuals was that none of these reports of neglect improved their family's well-being. None of these reports of neglect improved the family's well-being. And these voices came from folks that experienced this as children and as parents. So I want to spend a little more time really bringing their voices into the space and sharing a little bit more about what they said in this process. So this quote comes from Kim, and all of these names have been changed to ensure the confidentiality of our participants, of the lived experience leaders who shared. So Kim said, the first report of neglect happened when my son was in third grade, and he's 18 now. So it's a little while ago, but it was so life-changing to me that I still really want to talk about it. Both of my kids are autistic. They're both kind of atypical and were diagnosed later, which I think is a huge factor in the report of educational neglect. And I share that quote from Kim because we heard this a lot from parents, again, of neurodivergent or neurospicy kids, that it was their diagnoses that were really the driving factor in what they categorize as educational neglect. I also want to bring the voice of Dana into the space. Dana shared the fact that he, a partner, was able to weaponize a system as large as DCF is insane to me. People should not be able to weaponize DCF. They should be skilled enough to know not necessarily what's true and what's false, but at least to understand how to connect a proper investigation and to screen things out. But again, I'm not sure, or I would like to hope that my case is an anomaly and this isn't happening to people left and right, but maybe it is. I don't know. And Dana is a survivor of domestic violence, and her cases of unnecessary neglect were as a result of retaliatory filings from a former partner. Next, we have Carmen. Carmen was one of our lived experience experts who experienced a report of child neglect when they were a child. And Carmen shared, as a kid, I wasn't like feeling like I was being neglected. I felt comfortable in my home. And I felt like I didn't even want to move from that house because I had a lot of memories there. But at that age, I was thinking too, if they have a problem with our apartment or the way that we're living, they should help. And so Carmen shared in her story that they were living in public housing and a report was made for neglect. And when it was investigated, they found that the apartment they were living in didn't have a couch. It appeared maybe a little untidy and overcrowded. But Carmen talked at length about how if that was the assessment of the investigation, why did they separate her and her siblings instead of offering help? And she talked a lot about the apartment not being overcrowded in her mind, but being cozy and being warm. And so that's the voice of somebody who experienced a report as a child that felt like it was really unnecessary. And they were now, 19, 20 at the time of this conversation and still thinking deeply about that. And then there's Sarai. Sarai lives in the city of Boston and spoke at length about how many incredible resources there are for families here. But Sarai also shared, we're around a whole bunch of resources in a wealthy city. Like, what are we doing? I still can't get the help I need. And then when I am getting it, when somebody's actually helping me, then you're trying to limit the help. Do you want me to fail or do you want me to be successful? I don't know which one you want me to do, and it's kind of crazy. And so Sarai talked about the challenges of navigating a very resource-rich city, but also bumping up against some of the barriers that come with getting supports and services here, and how if those barriers had not existed, she believes the reports of neglect would never have been filed against her. And then we have Theo, the one dad in the space, the dad that participated in the study who was just absolutely, or the story banking, who was absolutely phenomenal. He shared a perspective that he's been told there's no room in the budget for fatherhood programs. He said, I've had to find means of my own to get involved and find support in the community. I'm 8 years into dealing with the child protection system, and not one service has been provided to me. Not one. So Theo really spoke about trying to navigate these systems from the perspective of a dad and looking for very specific support as a dad to parent and the struggles he found in that process. So then we had Melody, and Melody very tragically lost both of her parents to substance use disorder. Her experience with a report of neglect came as a result of her parents' substance use disorder when Melody was a child. And Melody shared, I really don't know like everyone's story, but I feel a certain way about child protective services because I feel that protecting the children also means getting help for the parents. And so Melody shared that now in her young adulthood, she thoroughly believes that both of her parents would be alive today if she and her siblings hadn't been separated by the child protection system. And so her hope was that maybe there were ways that the child protective system could get involved to offer substance use disorder support and treatment instead of separating families. And she really believes that not only would that have prevented an unnecessary report of neglect, that both of her parents would still be alive today if that had been the case. And then we have Sarah. Sarah also experienced reports of neglect as a child. And she said, I'd rather be living with my parents and living in this quote unquote neglectful situation than go with strangers. Ripping parents apart to me is not the solution. So I don't know. Like, I think there's something out there that could have helped both of them. I think instead of just, taking me away when that's not what I wanted. And so Sarah, much like the others, acknowledged that her families needed some support and really hoped that their families could have gotten that support, but instead that's not what they experienced. Okay. So you've heard directly from the voices of some of these folks with lived experience, and I want to ground us back into the initiative, which again is undergoing a rebranding, a new naming, so it will have a new name forthcoming, but the four pillars of this work will stay the same. So it is policy, programs, workforce, and community. And now I want to share across those four pillars what our lived experience experts shared as their recommendations based on their experiences. And once I've covered these four pillars, there's going to be another moment to pause and reflect. I'm happy to take down the slides. We can be in community, and I would love to hear reactions, thoughts, and reflections of what you're hearing and seeing from these lived experience leaders. So first, the family focus findings, as we call them, again, I love an alliteration. So the family focus findings that support the pillar of policy include utilizing lived experience data to inform legislative and systemic reforms. So very specifically, Melody and Theo emphasize that using stories to guide policy change that are rooted in lived experience could make our systems and structures stronger. Sarai highlighted how poverty and disability disproportionately impact families of color, calling for equity-driven reforms and lived experience leadership to support both like the big P policy and the small P policy. So what we heard from these leaders is like, infuse our stories, talk to us. We want to help inform the policy solutions that could prevent reports of neglect. Many of these folks also talked about investing in families and poverty alleviation as a key way to prevent neglect. You heard that in many of the different quotes that I shared about how folks were looking for supports and services. They know we're a resource-rich city in Boston and state and Massachusetts, but it was really hard to find the support they need. So they want to see deeper investments made there. You also heard from one of the domestic violence survivors that we spoke with, reforming the 51A process to prevent misuse was a big theme that we heard from folks. And not just misuse in the case of folks who have experienced domestic violence, but educational neglect. We heard often that parents who felt like they were maybe overzealous advocates for their children in educational settings were reprimanded with unnecessary reports of neglect. And so these folks all said, we would like to see a way to reform and prevent misuse of mandated reporting in these types of cases. They also asked for increased data collection and transparency. So several community members asked for increased data collection on 51As to ensure decision-making and enhance transparency. One of the recommendations that I really loved came from a mom who had experienced multiple reports of educational neglect. And she said it would be great if the Commonwealth of Massachusetts had a policy in place that at the end of every school year, data would be run on where the highest amounts of screened out reports of neglect came from by school district. And then maybe target those school districts for a conversation, additional training, connection to supports and services to see where within school systems we could understand better what's happening with reports of educational neglect. And last but not least, our lived experience leaders asked that we explore regulatory reforms to increase access to community-based supports and services. One of the most incredible stories I heard from a mom in the study had a medically complex child for whom she was struggling to find the right balance of care in Massachusetts. And so this mom found an incredible provider who happened to live in Chicago. Now, this provider had licensure in Connecticut, but not in Massachusetts. So this mom and her child got in the car and drove from central Massachusetts to just across the border in Connecticut so they could do a telehealth visit with this provider to begin to get some answers about a treatment plan for the child. And so this mom talked about a reform to licensure compacts, which if you're not familiar with licensure compacts, I was not expecting this as a policy reform out of this project, but this idea that if we can ensure timely access to care and appreciate that as amazing as Massachusetts is, our complex kiddos may not have all the care they need here. It may be elsewhere. But if we have things like they specifically talked about a licensure compact for the psychologist, the SIPAC, and having Massachusetts join the SIPAC, or having social workers join a licensure compact, it might make it a little bit easier for families experiencing children with disability, medical complexity, or complex mental health needs to get the care they need. And that could help prevent reports of neglect because that mom had said once they saw that provider and they were able to put a care plan in place, that things started to go a little bit smoother for them. So I loved that recommendation. So next up, programs. Our lived experience experts had a lot to say about programs, as you can see. So I'm going to just try to really quickly pull out a couple of these and let you just ground and center on this slide. So the number one thing that these folks asked for was a warm line. They talked about a warm line over and over and over. And a warm line is an alternative to a hotline. So right now, there's basically one number to call if you're a mandated reporter and you have this concern of child maltreatment. And what a warm line would do is kind of bifurcate abuse and neglect to say, if you have a concern about abuse, you call the hotline. If you have questions about neglect or it's about connecting folks with services, there's a warm line. And a key part of the warm line that our lived experience leaders spoke about extensively is it needs to be open to everyone. So they wanted to be able to call the warm line. In addition, they wanted their children's teachers or social workers or others to be able to call the warm line. So where's a one-stop shop that anyone looking for supports or services can call without judgment, without involving DCF, and just to get connected to the vast, rich resources that we had as a state. So that was hands down number one. They want to see a warm line. Another story that really struck with me, and this one I think is where my bias shows a little bit. I'm very big into little kids. And so we had a recommendation to expand early intervention services to age 5. Now, this could be a programmatic reform. It could also be a policy reform. But one of our moms shared a story about having a medically complex child who was getting early intervention or EI services and what a game changer those services were. And then they ended. And that's when the report of neglect happened because this mom and this family fell into this gap where early intervention services ended and the child wasn't yet in school. So there was no IEP, there was no additional supports and services. So this mom talked about closing that gap and ensuring that early intervention could go up to age 5, and then there would be a warm handoff into the school system. And that would have prevented the report of neglect for that family. Another one that I want to highlight, if you were able to join us recently for our in-person gathering that we did, I guess that was last month now, time is a construct. But we heard from some of the folks in the room about programs that provide respite care to families of children with disabilities. And I want to highlight that this concept of respite care was a programmatic intervention that many of the families spoke about. That like as parents, we all need a break sometimes. Whether your child is medically complex or not, we all need to be able to take breaks. And one of the things that really resonated with me about this recommendation is as a licensed foster care provider, I get 10 paid respite days a year. And so I sign up to be a foster parent and I have a built-in structure and system of support where I can say, hey, I need a break, or like I need to go to doctor's appointments, or I need to take my dog to the vet. And there's a built-in structure where I can get respite and support that is not a formal childcare system so that I can balance my well-being and my needs. And these lived experience experts would love to see the same thing. How are we building in a programmatic form of respite care for families so that people can take breaks and ensure that they're being their best selves for their children? Another example that I'll share from programs, did I put it on this slide? A lot of conversations about co-located services in public housing as well as in the shelter system and the domestic violence system. So folks spoke at length at how do we develop programs that are situated where families are already naturally finding themselves, especially in the shelter and housing system. And then last but not least, many of the children who experience reports of neglect against their parents really spoke about wishing that there had been more access to mental health supports and services and substance use disorder support for their parents as a form of preventing reports of neglect. Okay. Then we have the workforce. And so our lived experience experts thought really deeply about the workforce and what they want all of you to know. And they really talked at length about specialized training, specifically in education and healthcare. And this idea that the workforce should have separate trainings because what happens in education and what happens in the healthcare space might look a little bit different. And so they would love to see deeply specialized training to support folks based on where they're operating and where and how they encounter children and families. Let's see. Also in the workforce, they spoke about increased cross-sector collaboration. So understanding that children and families don't live in silos, but so often the work that we all do does. And so how do we break down those silos within the workforce so that we're doing a better job of talking to one another and a better job of supporting families as a result? And then last but not least, the lived experience experts talked about developing accountability strategies within the workforce. So accountability mainly from frivolous or retaliatory reports of neglect, because that was an experience that was fairly common, again, primarily in the educational neglect sector based on what we heard from the families. And last but not least, community was a little trickier to wrap our arms around when we had conversations about how can community show up to help prevent some of the reports of neglect. And so, one of the interesting things that the lived experience experts shared was education and awareness, almost like a PSA of sorts, about what is a 51A, what is mandated reporting. And they felt that if there was a public awareness campaign to clarify what all of this meant and the potential harm, that it might create some discretion and community-based responses like mutual aid as a result of people understanding, like, if you call the hotline or if you file on somebody, it doesn't mean that like a struggling family is going to get furniture. It doesn't mean that, kids who don't have winter coats on that first cold day in the fall are going to get winter coats, that there are other ways that we as a community can come together to support one another with these things. Many of our lived experience experts also spoke about social isolation and this idea of like they didn't have a village around them. They didn't have a support system. And so they felt like that could be a community response that they were looking for. Theo, the dad in our story banking, talked about this. He said, like, well, where are the other dads that I could have gone to, or programs for dads where I could have been in community that could have helped him advocate in different ways for his child to have prevented the situation that he encountered. And then last, they pretty much all spoke about breaking generational cycles and thinking about their aspirations and their hope for the future of their children. And so, how are we thinking about healing centered community care that uplifts family strengths, that centers joy and play and healing? How are communities doing that? These are things that folks felt as though could have been community responses that would have prevented the reports of neglect that they experience. Okay. So, with any form of research or story banking, it's always just important to acknowledge that there were limitations to this. And so, this was a very small study of 11 folks, a small story banking project. They were from around the state, but they were all from Massachusetts. So, this might look different if we did this in other states or other localities, or if we said we're only going to do this in the 413 or the 781 or a different area. It's also important to acknowledge that the folks that signed up to talk to me most likely were folks that had negative experiences. We didn't have anybody sign up to say a report of neglect changed my life. It made everything better. Everyone who signed up to talk to us had what they would qualify as a suboptimal experience, and that's why they wanted to share our story. So that's always part of the limitations of when you do a qualitative process with self-reporting. And then just being mindful of I shared my positionality, but many of these folks, again, have their own positionality. But a big shared piece of this was all of this was done in English. So we did not have the capacity to do this with folks who spoke another language other than English. We also did this over Zoom. And so we were talking with folks that had a certain level of technology literacy. But we did offer to meet folks in person if they preferred to do it in person. So just important to name as valuable and incredibly rich as these recommendations are, there were some limitations to our process. And so we encourage those of you that are working with families or doing similar types of work to take from this project and to see if you were to ask this question to populations you work with, what types of recommendations might they have? Okay. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing. I can see that there's been some stuff put in the chat. So the doors of the chat are open if folks want to come off mute. This is our opportunity to have a little bit about a conversation around this first body of work that we've been discussing on today before we transition to talk about the next body of work. I'm going to scroll through the chat and I see Diana talking about respite care. Absolutely. Like, who wouldn't benefit from respite care, right? How amazing as we think about like building a village and supporting families. That idea of having a structural form of respite care, like I would sign up for that. I would sign up to be a part of how can I help my neighbors if one of my neighbors has to run to the vet or has an emergent doctor's appointment, like how could I take their kids for a few hours and help out? So yeah, supporting one another and building respite system would be amazing. And then I see just folks introducing themselves. Yes, once folks hit 3, EI refers to the public school system. And we heard that there's still systemic gaps there and things are not working optimally. And I think one of the big themes of this was also that that family just loved their EI providers and loved the support they were getting. They weren't ready to lose all of that in that moment. And so it was that loss of all the support they had that really triggered the report of neglect when things got really hard for them. But in an ideal situation, they should be referred to the public school system. Fiona, I see your hand up.
I just wanted to touch on the EI kind of piece because this is something I experienced with a family that I was working very closely with, where a child that was diagnosed with autism lost services at 3. And there were issues with getting that referral to the school. Their daycare was ending, and this single mom was pretty much left without any supports. It just all stopped at once. And there ended up being another DCF report filed shortly afterwards, and it's just everything you're saying. I witnessed. Had seen this happen, and I remember it being really hard. It was a really hard kind of case that I worked on, and kind of seeing what had happened with this family and kind of some of the effects from it. I also think that EI is home visiting, and we know that home visiting is
Mm.
so impactful for families, and it's a service in Massachusetts that everyone has access for free, but having somebody come into your home, hear the struggles that you're going through, kind of see some of those struggles sometimes is just, it's so impactful. I was a mom who used EI for my youngest, and them coming and being able to educate me and connect me to the services here in the Berkshires was extremely helpful. My child didn't end up needing a referral to the public school, so my services did end very unexpectedly. And my family was okay, but it felt like a gap. There was something
Yeah.
missing there. So I just think that that EI, that expansion to age 5, really focusing in on that early education, and that support for parents, because we know that if we can get to kids and families when they're young, we're going to have a huge impact on their future. We're going to have an impact on these children's futures, but we can also really support these parents too. So I just wanted to share that story and that experience that I had.
Man, thank you so much for sharing that story and that experience, and both your own experience as well, Fiona. Yeah, I mean, early intervention is an incredible program. And I think that all children and families in the state would benefit from seeing it expanded to age 5. And hopefully, a byproduct of that would be fewer reports of neglect because we would have these stronger early childhood systems supporting our littles through that transition as they go into kindergarten. So thank you for sharing that. Any other stories, recommendations that are sparking curiosity, that are resonating, that there are questions about? There was another one that I thought I put it on the slides, but I might have taken it off. Again, because I'm an early childhood person. I will just share one of the moms we spoke to was a second shift worker and talked about the need to expand childcare to second shift workers because so much of our childcare here is based around like a 9 to 5 workday. And even then, sometimes it is like it's like 10 to 3 or it's like crazy. And then you're figuring out pre-care and aftercare and after school. And this mom told the story of she had just transitioned out of shelter. Her and another mom had transitioned out around the same time. They were able to get an apartment together, and neither of them could find childcare. And so they struck an agreement because they worked different hours that they would each watch one another's children while the other worked. And the mom I spoke to said, like, I knew she didn't exactly embody all the values that I had as a mom, and it probably wasn't who I would have chose to leave my child with, but it was the only option I had. And the report of neglect happened because of the individual that mom had watching her child because she couldn't find off hours childcare. And so, how are we thinking about, in Massachusetts, where like so many of our jobs are in healthcare and folks are working hospitals and off shift hours? How are we building out that part of our early childhood system so that folks can work various different types of jobs, various different types of shifts, and know that their children are in a safe early education and care arrangement? So, that was another bit of a story and some feedback we got from a participant.
Kate, do we have time for me to share a story really quick?
Yes, please.
Yeah. So I think these stories are powerful and help us remember that it's not just one-offs, that the one-offs are adding up to quite a bit and quite a number of families that are in our state that are needing more support. So I was working in the emergency department this weekend and had a mom that her child was being hospitalized and she was worried that she wouldn't be able to stay with him because he had just turned 19 but has significant medical complexities and is on the autism spectrum and cannot really advocate for himself. He presented well enough, but was worried about that. So really working through, like, she had the guardianship temporary paperwork, like working through all those conversations. So just in my conversation with mom and getting to know her, learning that she has 3 kids, all of them have significant complexities, either mental health or medical. And she had her own medical stuff that I could see. She had a brace on her, and at one point I just said, like, when are you getting a break? Like, who's caring for
Yeah.
you? And she was like, I don't have time for me. Like, I have a great doctor and they're checking in on me, but like I don't have time to take care of all of my medical stuff. I'm dealing with all of the ones that I have, my kids. And so I know her pediatric clinic and it is phenomenal and does really good work with families, but she had not been connected to any of the systems, none of the services, none of the social supports that are available at her clinic. And I think what I got to the end of it was that she had never presented as needing anything.
Yeah.
She came in very well put together. She didn't tell them what it took for her to get to her kids' pediatric appointments. And so maybe the questions weren't being asked or she wasn't disclosing that, but was really trying to educate her around there's so many things you're eligible for. Let's make sure we
Yeah.
get you connected to those. And here's the person you need to ask for and all of that. So I'm sharing this in that um, our society has it that it's not okay to ask for help. And
Yeah.
with a fear, which I know we're going to get into next,
Yeah.
and what happens when our parents don't feel like they can safely say, hey, I need help, and what that might mean for their children or their family structure. And part of this initiative work, too, is just our ability to really shift how we think about how hard this is and that it is okay to ask for help and that we are here to actually support and not judge and condemn and all of that. And so, even in those quick seconds, I was able to show her a couple places that she's like, I had no idea that any of this existed. And so, also, I think one of the the number one request for the program side from families that you heard was the warm line, what other people call a
Yes.
resource hotline, Mass 211, like all of those things. Like, how do we let people learn how to fish themselves? But you've got to have the
Yeah.
nets and the fishing line and all of that available. And we don't right now as a state. And so, um, just some of the things that were coming up for me as you were talking.
Thank you for sharing that story, Jen. And like, I could just, they shared so many incredible stories with me. I could spend all day talking about the stories, but I want to shift us ever so slightly into the next part of today. But the piece I want to leave us with is as I spoke with these parents, as a parent who has never had a report of neglect against me, the world that they were talking about wanting and the changes they wanted to see, I wanted that for me too. And so I think the recommendations they made, I know the recommendations they made, they're good for all children and families in the Commonwealth. So building social connectedness in community, finding policies and programs that really meet the needs of kids and families, and having a workforce that works together to do all of that and breaks down silos. I just thought, like, what a beautiful vision they have painted for all of us across the Commonwealth and for our friends that have joined us from outside of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts as well. Okay. So I am going to shift us ever so slightly just back into intention setting and the intention that you maybe set at the outset. And now we're in the home stretch of our last 30 minutes together. And just invite you to reground into that because we're going to shift and talk about a very different project that had, I think, very similar underlying themes. And so I am calling this It Only Takes One Time and They Will Open a File on You. What Black mothers can teach us about navigating the Boston early childhood ecosystem. And this is just a little teeny snapshot of a larger PhD. And I've kind of put this together to be a supportive component to the project that we did with Children's Trust. And anytime I talk about this work, I have to first start by giving gratitude to the Commonwealth Children's Fund. They made sure that we were able to give gift cards to the moms who participated in this study. I should have said too that Children's Trust, we ensured that all of the participants in the story banking also got gift cards for their time and investment in this work. It is just such an important and underspoken about part of how we drive equity in these processes, not just to invite people to come and talk about really hard things, but to ask them to talk about solutions, their hopes, their aspirations, and then to ensure that their time is compensated for. So that was done in this project through the Commonwealth Children's Fund. So then as part of my dissertation, I think the longest part of the whole thing is my literature review. So I am going to spare you the roughly 90 pages of my literature review, but just want to ground us in three different facts that really help to support and be the foundation of this dissertation. So in federal fiscal year 2022, which was at the time that I was writing this, the most recent data, nearly 75% of child maltreatment reports nationally were for neglect. And in Massachusetts, it was an even higher share. So sometimes when people are like, well, why neglect? Why is that what we're talking about? I have to remind myself all the time that most people in the general population and even most people who work with children don't know this. They don't know that when we're talking about child maltreatment, most of what is coming into the system is for neglect and not abuse. So that is a really important data point to always ground in. Next, my work really focused on moms of very young children, and that was super intentional because we know when it comes to Black parents, they experience much higher rates of TPR or termination of parental rights than their white counterparts, and that is most likely to happen in early childhood. So at the most rapid phase of brain development, growth, bonding, that's when we're seeing our young Black children separated from their parents. And then last but not least, I thought it really interesting, like when we think about like who's filing in early childhood, nationally, we don't collect data on this, but there have been a few studies that look at like early education and care providers because they care for over 7 million children, but they're making up a really small percentage of what's getting reported. So there are some places across this early childhood ecosystem and continuum that we can look to see where are there higher filings, where are there lower filings, what does that mean in early childhood, and how do we respond accordingly? And so with that, in a dissertation, you're often asked, like, what is the problem? What is the gap? Like, why this project? Why now? And so I refer to in my study CPS or the Child Protection System because it is a system. And so the data in the literature and the literature review showed us very clearly that Black children are disproportionately involved. We know that that is driven by anti-Black racism, systemic bias, and social economic inequities. So that drives kind of poverty being equated as neglect. We know that for Black families, CPS contact is most likely to occur in early childhood in a critical phase of growth and development. And then the other thing I found is I'm a social worker by training. My PhD was in social work, and there wasn't a lot of social work scholarship on this. So social workers we weren't talking about it, we weren't researching it, we weren't writing about it. And so I really wanted this to be a project by and for social workers and just the broader community of folks that serve families and bring in the intersectionality of child protection along with the experience of Black mothers with a very specific focus on Black moms with no prior involvement in child protection. There is a growing body of literature that's doing projects like that story banking project that is talking to parents that have experience within child protection, but nobody's really doing the work of going like even further upstream and saying statistically, you're likely to have an encounter with CPS, but you haven't yet. So let's have that conversation. And that's really what the goal of this work was to do. And so, as part of a PhD, they also make you put together a theoretical framework, which, if you love theory, like this slide is for you. And if you don't love theory, I'm going to try to make it as not wonky as possible. But I think it's important to share because what I did was I really weaved and threaded together 3 different theoretical frameworks to think about this project. One was structural social work theory, the second was intersectionality, and the third was Black feminist thought. When you put that all together, basically what it meant was the theoretical framework for this study was concerned with people, policies, and power. The people were Black mothers. And some of the ways that Black motherhood is racialized in this nation, one of the terms that's used often is misogynoir, which is a term that was coined in 2018 to talk about the racialized and gendered violence that Black women experience. So how does that experience help us to understand Black mothers in the context of policy and power dynamics? In terms of the policy, the key policy here was what we call the front door or mandated reporting, because that is where, again, the Black moms are most likely to encounter a possible CPS experience is through mandated reporting. And then the power dynamics, very specifically in this study, were centered around the early childhood ecosystem. So when we say the early childhood ecosystem, we're thinking about everything from healthcare, early education and care, early intervention, home visiting, any type of service or support that a family or child experiences in the 0 to 5 space. And so those three theories that I mentioned are what we call critical social theories. And I paired that with a methodological approach called critical phenomenology. And basically, what all of this means is how do we take a critical look at the daily experiences and the essence of decision making for Black moms in terms of the early childhood ecosystem? So to do that, I had two specific research questions here. And the most fascinating thing about these research questions were I never really got to research question number two because when I asked research question number one to the moms in the study about how do you experience decision making in the early childhood ecosystem for your child, they immediately went to power dynamics, systemic inequities, the child protection system without me even asking. So I didn't even ask question number two. And that was how they responded to question number one. And I think that that's really telling that Black moms in Boston couldn't talk about how they make decisions for their children without naming all of these other factors that they experience every day. And so I want to talk a little bit about the community contributors, much like I did with the other project. I want you to know who the brilliant and wonderful people are who shared their stories. And so the community contributors, as I called them for this project, ranged in age from 28 to 41. There were 12 of them. When I asked about their ancestry or how they defined their background, they described themselves as Haitian, Jamaican, Cape Verdean, Trinidadian, and having Afro-Latina ancestry. The moms in the study were both straight and identified as LGBTQIA. And when I asked where they lived in the city of Boston, they primarily resided in Roxbury, Dorchester, Mattapan, and Hyde Park. One of my favorite things about the moms in the study, they were incredibly educated. I talked to one mom who was also doing her PhD. And so it was really cool to sit and talk with her. And she had her young baby there. And I thought, like, I made a joke to that mom. I said, like, wow, your baby's being exposed to like two PhDs before he even turns 3. Like, how cool is that that he is having this exposure? And we had other moms who had MPHs that were public health experts and healthcare executives. And so these moms were highly educated, very successful, deeply connected to their communities. And so again, just to reground, the purpose of this study was to ask these moms of young children, and they didn't have any children over the age of 5. So these are like new moms, first-time moms. Like, how are you making decisions for your children? What is that experience like in the early childhood ecosystem in Boston? So that was the goal, to understand the essence of their experience. And just like with the other project, I want you to hear their voices, and I want you to hear a little bit of what they shared. So again, I called them community contributors, and then I put a number so I could distinguish who they were. I didn't make up names for them like we did with the other project. So in this case, community contributor 2, or CC2, was a social worker. And she shared, and this is where the title for the project comes, it only takes these people one time to go tell somebody that you're not doing something right or that your child is not hitting the benchmarks or something like that. And they can open a file on you and your kids could be taken away. That's literally how I was feeling. Like, I come here in good faith to get the resources for my child so that he has the most opportunity to learn and grow and become his best self. I'm coming here and doing that, and you're not being responsive. But you can write down anything you can write anything down about me or what we're doing here or not doing, and that could have a detrimental impact. So it's a very scary place to navigate. And again, this is a social worker. This is somebody who is a mandated reporter in their work, and this is how they're feeling as a new mom making decisions. That mom that I mentioned, who is the educator and the doctoral student, she was CC20, and she's originally from Jamaica. And so she shared some really interesting insights about a comparative analysis between the Caribbean and here. And she said, I feel like in the Caribbean, no one is coming to check necessarily, but America feels a bit more like, and her voice would trail off. And then her voice came back and she said, I feel like somebody is watching. She said, I know they're not, but it just feels that way. And if you don't do the thing right, they can And then her voice trailed off again, as if she was almost afraid to say what they could do. And she said, I don't know. It's just like background fear. And so here you have a new mom talking about being afraid to make decisions for her young child. And this is a mom who, while she's a second generation immigrant, she's a doctoral student. She is very accomplished. She works with children. She herself is a mandated reporter and is talking about the fear she has navigating systems. And then we had a lawyer, again, a mandated reporter, somebody who understands the law, understands these things. And she shared, I'm more hyper focused on making sure I'm safe, my kids are safe, because I don't know if people consider my best interest when I'm in certain spaces. And so I do just have to be aware of where I am and how I'm being perceived. So this idea of like this mom is doing all this emotional labor to understand how spaces are interpreting and judging her behaviors. This mom also shared that like she always, when she goes into spaces to make decisions for her children, she has two young kids under the age of 3, she leads with I'm a lawyer. And she talked about if I tell them I'm a lawyer, then all the stereotypes of a bad black mom might fall away and they might not report me and my kids for something. What was the other thing this mom shared? Oh, this mom also shared a quote that didn't make it into this, but is in my larger dissertation, where she flat out said, I don't think these systems and structures care about our babies. They don't show me that they care about our babies. And so that really led to her hyper awareness of making decisions for her children. And then we had a healthcare executive. Again, and I can't stress enough, like these people are mandated reporters in their jobs. So this is a healthcare executive who, when I asked her, have you ever had to file on anyone? She said, like, yes, I have in my professional role. But we are talking about her decision making, and she said, I've heard the stereotypes of Black moms, and like they always beat their kids, they don't know how to take care of them, and the foster care system and all this other stuff. And she said, I'm not someone who's going to think that I get a pass from all of that just because I have a master's degree. I can't do that. So, this idea that you have these educated, well-resourced mothers of young children making decisions and still feeling like they could have their children taken away. And then this one was really fascinating. So Community Contributor 6 is an early educator and a mandated reporter. And she shared that she was struggling to go back to work as an early educator because she didn't want to leave her child with another early educator because she was afraid they might file a report of neglect on her. And I thought that was so powerful. Somebody whose job it is every day, people hand their babies over to her to care for them, but she didn't feel safe to do the same with her baby. She also shared, talking a lot about medical appointments, all the well baby visits at the beginning of her child's life, because her baby was only 4 months old at the time of this conversation. She said, I think about them, mandated reporters, a lot when I'm at the doctor's or during doctor's appointments for the baby. The questions they're asking me. And it's always me and my partner in the appointment. So I'm always hyper aware of what we say and how it can be interpreted. So again, this like hyper awareness, emotional labor, all of the things that these moms are navigating to try to ensure their very, very young children get what they need and there aren't reports filed against them. Okay. So an interesting part about the dissertation process is that I wasn't necessarily supposed to highlight what the moms said they wanted, but in this space, it's not an academic space, so I get to do whatever I want. And I want to tell you what the moms said. I want to tell you what the moms asked for because they were very clear with what they said should happen and how they want it to happen. So I'm going to share those things with you. And then I'm also going to share the whole academic implications that I had to put together because those are okay too. But the good stuff is what the moms said. So the moms really talked a lot about trust. And what they said from folks, and whether you work in early childhood or you work with older kids, that trust has to be earned and not assumed. And so they asked that folks build relational trust through consistent, accountable engagement and making sure that we are really centering trust as mandated reporters in everything that we do. Second, they talked a great deal about transparency and wanting there to be clear, accessible communication about processes and decisions. This came up a lot about like, what are you writing down in the file about me and my family? What data or information are you keeping? How is that being shared? If a report has to be filed, what does that look like? What is your process? Are you going to talk to me first? Are you going to call me first? Like, how does all of this work? And so transparency was really key for them to engage authentically and meaningfully within systems where mandated reporters are present. Next, you heard this kind of like hyper awareness that came up so often for the moms. They want folks to recognize that emotional and structural pressures that they're navigating. So by the time they get in front of you, or by the time you come into their home, they are maybe on high alert, they are exhausted, they are fearful, even if you are providing help and providing support. And so how do we combat is that as mandated reporters? Well, the mom said, reduce judgment, extend grace. They talk all the time about they feel like white moms get grace extended to them in ways that they don't experience as a Black mom, and just validate the lived experience of Black families. 4, naming systemic bias as a form of trust building. So the mom spoke very specifically about having providers in their life that name systemic bias and name some of the power dynamics openly. So, for example, if you're giving a family a brochure about some type of support or service, and there's no diversity on that brochure, like naming that, like, this is the only brochure I have to explain this to you. And I know it doesn't maybe reflect you or your family, but like, here's the value in the support that I'm providing. And so naming that bias openly. There was a mom who spoke about their child having a skin condition. And as they were talking to the provider about the skin condition, the provider said, well, here's what we were taught and how it shows up in the literature, but here's what I know is true when it comes to melanated skin and how we need to think about this differently. So just naming some of these things openly, the mom said would be really helpful. The moms talked a lot about workforce diversity and how that can be an intervention towards building equity. And so they very plainly said, we need to see more Black and brown faces in the spaces that are caring for our children. So it's not just about hiring, it's about retaining these folks so that the early childhood ecosystem and really all services and supports can be more diverse and reflective of, they said, not just their own cultures, but other cultures, that they were really craving rich cultural experiences for their children. And then last but not least, creating these clear connected pathways to resources and supports. This again comes to the piece about like the interconnected nature of all of this, breaking down silos. These moms were like, where can we turn to get support navigating these systems? Who can help us understand these things? So you're seeing a lot of similarities between what these moms were asking for and what the story banking participants were asking for, is for all of us to work together and build more connected systems and structures. So that's what the moms had to say. And then just a few words from me about what I took away from my time in community with them. And this first one is an implication for practitioners, early educators, and really all of us, is that we need to be interrogating how mandated reporting and institutional surveillance reproduce harm, and how they reproduce harm for folks that haven't even ever experienced it, right? These moms have never had a report filed on them, and they're thinking about it constantly. And so how do we as mandated reporters honor that, think about that, and interrogate what that means for the work we do with families? If we have policymakers and advocates here, this is a call to one of those 4 policy pillars that we spoke about earlier. We need to do a better job of prioritizing dignity, autonomy, and well-being in the policies that we work on. If there are any fellow researchers in this space, I hope that modeling these types of methodologies, both in this project and the previous project, show how incredibly important it is to center voices of lived experience when we're thinking about doing this systems transformation work. All of this work is making what the Children's Trust is doing better and stronger because we've centered voices with lived experience. And again, just want to share that as wonderful as this all is, there's always limitations. And so these limitations, very similar to the limitations of the previous study, these were conducted in English. we were having very hard conversations about difficult things. So it might have constrained some of the things that were shared. And then just the context, like this was done in Massachusetts, very specifically in Boston. And so this might look very different if this same study was done in a different part of Massachusetts or even a different state. So the big takeaway from this particular study and this particular project is that the power of CPS extends far beyond any formal contact with the system, and it's influencing what Black mothers are experiencing in early childhood. And so the invitation here is for us to acknowledge, name, and hold this and think about how we're radically reimagining the work that we're doing with families that we know are most statistically likely to encounter reports of neglect, especially in early childhood. Because again, I'm an early childhood girly, and I really just feel like if we get this right at the earliest stages of a baby's life, we change not just the trajectory of that baby's life, but of that family's life and of the future of our society. So if you're interested, my PhD will be published shortly. There are 45 pages of references. And so if this was speaking to you, there's lots of good reading materials, ways to follow up, deepen your own growth and learning about everything that I covered very, very quickly. And I want to hold space for some questions and reflections. But again, before we get to kind of closing out with questions and reflections, this is an invitation again for you to join us in this work. I hope that whatever seeds were planted or knowledge that you learned today is helpful for your work and your journey. But I really invite you to take the next step and join us in this work. So make sure you're getting the newsletter, make sure you're staying connected, maybe consider signing up to join one of those 4 work groups that reflects these 4 pillars. This work is community powered. And so there are so many of us that are just coming together across sectors to figure out what we can do in these 4 pillars. And we would love to invite you to join us. And then I also want to tell you to save the date. I know December feels like a long way away, but it will be here in a blink of an eye. This work we've now taken to doing, and Jen can correct me if I'm wrong, but doing kind of 2 convenings a year, one in May, one in December. And these are opportunities to come be in community, to have these conversations, to hear these learnings, to interrogate our own work, and then talk about solutions together. So save the date, December 10th. We will be back in Norwood, Mass at the 4 Point Sheraton to be in community, in real life, in 3D to continue these conversations. So I'll begin or end where we started with just any reflections, things that are coming up for folks. I will stop sharing for the last time so we can see each other as we begin to wrap up. So any final questions, comments as I peruse the chat? Yeah, Marissa.
Hello there. Thank you so much for this today. I really appreciated it. I am a social worker in an early childhood education setting. So this last part really resonated with me. A lot of times my work is directly communicating with children who are enrolled in a DCF supportive slot. And so my interactions with teachers or other staff, sometimes I'm reflective and being like, okay, what is the point? Or what's the intention of me sharing certain information, and what are ways I can share information where it's not leading to monitoring or surveillance. And so I've just really tried to be engaged in that reflective process at every stage, no matter where that frustration is coming from. Like something really does need to happen, but does it need to come from them? Or like where can I boost up my expertise in responding to the family's needs? So just wanted to thank you for that.
I love that. Well, thank you for the work you do, Marissa. And I'll share kind of a composite of a couple different stories that I heard from both of these projects and another project I was working on of a Black woman social worker working in an early childhood setting. And a Black mom said to me, like, I love that she's here in this setting, but I still don't trust her all the way. Like she still has to earn my trust. And she talked about like all skin folk ain't kinfolk. And then I had another mom that was working with the same social worker, and this story just gives me chills. So last summer I was moving and I had to downsize, and I'm a foster parent. So I had like all this stuff for littles that I had to get rid of. And so I reached out to all my social worker friends and different folks and said, is anybody working with a family maybe transitioning out of shelter that could use like children's furniture, books, etc.? And one of my social worker friends raised her hand and said, I'm working with a family, would love to connect you. And we were able to do that and get them the furniture. And me and the social worker friend were literally like dropping off the furniture to them, like in community, mutual aid, all the things. And the mom says to me, can you even believe a week ago she was filing on me, and this week she's helping me get furniture? And the mom told me this whole story about some stuff that happened, and she knew the social worker had to file, and the social worker filed with mom present, made the phone call with mom present. When we talk about like transparency, right? Like talked her through, here's what's going to happen. Here's why I have to do this. I already spoke to my supervisor about it. She agrees it needs to happen. But the social worker did it in a way where there was transparency, there was trust, and that relationship wasn't broken. And because of it, a material economic need that that family had was met a week later. And so I just think there's so much power in these recommendations that we heard in both cases of how we can honor that, like some of these systems and structures need to be changed. But given what we have now, how do we navigate them in ways that really center the dignity of families? So thank you for the work you do, Marissa, and thank you for sharing your reflection.
Kate, I
Fiona.
see we
Oh,
have Fiona with her hands up and it's
yeah,
1:28. So I just want to be mindful.
perfect,
We'll take Fiona's and then we'll wrap up. That sound good?
perfect.
Okay, awesome.
I just wanted to share, Marissa, it seems like you and I have very similar roles in an early childhood setting, working with, supported slots. And I have to agree, it's how we share information and the bias that's created, even not even just with teachers, but as we look at kind of administration and stuff, it's so real. And I've been doing this work for about a year and a half, and it's really not something I truly understood until I was in the thick of it. And I'm a white female, so there is a lot of stuff that I can't relate to or understand, and really trying to educate myself on, how these systems are impacting people, black individuals and, moms and stuff that are encountering this, and I see it. I'm actually seeing it. And I, I just want to be able to support people in the best way I can. And really understanding the bias that's created and how that bias impacts the care and how people feel towards families is real. It's very real, and we have to be really careful on how we support them, because creating that bias can just create so many other things. And I've been in conversations about whether to file a 51A, and sometimes I'm sitting there like shaking my head like, why are we talking about filing a 51A? Why aren't we talking about what supports we can put in place? How can we support this family? So I just wanted to share that. And again, thank you for this presentation. For me, again, this was very eye-opening in the work that I do and how I continue to do this work.
Thank you, Fiona. And I'll turn it over to Jen to close us out, but just want to end with gratitude. Thank you all for spending your lunch hour and then some being in community, having these conversations. And I hope this is not the first and last time that I see many of you engaged in this work. So thanks for being
It
here.
won't be.
Over to you, Jen.
Thank you so much, Kate. So appreciative of you and all that you've done and all that you are teaching and leading all of us through. So thank you, thank you, thank you. So we're going to wrap up today. I have up on your screen, these are the next ones that we have coming. If you were at our convening last month, you heard Matthew doing his work on standpoint theory. And there is much, much more that he wants to go on that road with us in Massachusetts, so that as we are doing this work, we are being intentional about how race, how bias, how racism is all playing into this, and all of the work that we have to do on ourselves and on our systems, our decision makers, so that we are making better decisions and creating better environments for all of us. So please sign up. You've got the QR code right there. Would love to see you at those as well. And thanks for taking the time. Thanks for being a part of this initiative, this ground swelling of effort and work. And we look forward to seeing you at the next one. Enjoy your day. Bye-bye.